Trust no one with the power to endanger liberty. That warning from John Adams in 1772, it split the founders just 15 years later when they were debating ratification of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalist side took it as gospel. You can never trust the man. End of story. The Federalist side, well, they countered, maybe so, but you certainly can trust the plan. So on this episode, it's all about trust, one of the most important, foundational, and almost totally forgotten debates over ratification of the Constitution. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome. And thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, October 29th, 2025. Let's get right to it with the Anti-Federalist case against trust. And they made it with a dose of cold reality. In the New York ratifying convention, it was John Williams. He laid out the rule. And this is the starting point. Free people never grant a power to, well, politicians that can't be exercised without harming the people themselves. He said, no prudent people will trust power with their rulers. I guess you could have ended there. No prudent people will trust power with their rulers that cannot be exercised without injuring them. And in Virginia, Patrick Henry took it even further. Treat liberty like a priceless treasure and really expect that basically anyone who gets even close to it, well, they're trying to steal it. He said, guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel. And Brutus, in his 8th essay, he warned that this wasn't just about a few bad apples. This is all about human nature. Even the best of us are corrupted when we hold power. End of story. He said, besides, sir, we know the passions of men. We know how dangerous it is to trust the best of men with too much power. He's not even talking about the worst of them yet. I think there was no Anti-Federalist who really summed up this case better than a guy they called Old Abraham White in Massachusetts. It really didn't matter for him. It didn't matter how good the people who held power were. It didn't matter if they were all awesome. He wouldn't trust them even if they were the most trustworthy people in history and replicated as over and over and over. He said, I wouldn't trust a flock of Moseses. And this wasn't just theory. It was based in all their history books. They knew it from lessons that they read and learned about. In South Carolina, it was James Lincoln who warned that once you hand over liberty, the result is always the same. Tyranny. He said, let the people but once trust their liberties out of their own hands. And what will be the consequence? Well, it's going to break down. He said, first, a haughty, imperious aristocracy, and ultimately a tyrannical monarchy. Now back to Patrick Henry. We're going to talk about him quite a bit here. He pointed to an example that they were all aware of. Now, some of them on the Federalist side thought this was an awesome example, but the Anti-Federalists certainly did not. In Holland, it started out as what they considered a free republic. Then they trusted their liberty to a chief magistrate, someone known as the stadtholder. And then that office ended up being hereditary. And then over time, it created a de facto tyranny, a hereditary aristocracy. And that's how Henry described it. He said, will the American president come and lay prostrate at the feet of Congress his laurels? I fear there are few men who can be trusted on that head. The glorious Republic of Holland has erected monuments of her warlike intrepidity and valor. Yet, she is now totally ruined by a stadtholder, a Dutch president. Henry then attacked this good man argument head on. It doesn't matter if you start out with good people. That's not going to last because of human nature. It's just not good enough. Not even close. He said, if you have a good president, senators, and representatives, there is no danger. But can this be expected from human nature? And if you answered this no absolutely not. You definitely passed Patrick Henry's test for the day. Anyways, continuing, he said, without real checks, it will not suffice that some of them are good. Now, this wasn't an argument to say they weren't debating that there weren't checks and balances, but the Federalist side, as we'll see in a little bit, they were taking the position that, yes, there's checks and balances, but you have to trust that they're going to do the right thing, and the plan makes certain that that will happen. And the Anti-Federalist side, Patrick Henry and others, are saying, well, this isn't a real check, it's a phantom. So these aren't checks and balances in practice. And we have to rely on trust. And because we can't trust people due to human nature with power, well, things are going to go very poorly. And that's what he said. A good president or senator or representative will have a natural weakness. Virtue will slumber. The wicked will be continually watching. Consequently, you will be undone. And back to Brutus, he then pointed out one of the most famous examples ever. This is the ultimate proof from history where, well, it was Rome's best people, their best citizens, the most faithful army, the ones who were supposed to protect them from the bad guys, that ended up, well, in the crossing of the Rubicon, enslaving their own people. He said, where was a braver army than that under Julius Caesar? Where was there ever an army that had served their country more faithfully? That army, he wrote, was commanded generally by the best citizens of Rome, by men of great fortune and figure in their country, yet that army enslaved their country. And back to Virginia, this time William Grayson. He exposed the entire Federalist case about trusting the plan, which we'll get to a little bit more in a moment. He knew that this was the oldest trick in the book of tyrants, and the same one that was used by the tyrant Cromwell in England. He said it seems to have been a rule with the gentlemen on the other side to argue from the excellency of human nature in order to induce us to grant away, if I may be allowed the expression, the rights and liberties of our country. Basically, they kept telling them over and over and over, this is a system that's going to draw the best of the best to the top, and the best of the best on the top. You may be concerned that some of these terms in here are vague, like general welfare and necessary and proper, and commerce and things like that. Commander-in-chief, you may be concerned about vagueness in these clauses, but we don't have to worry about that because we're explaining what that means today. And the system, trust the plan, will draw the good people there, and we don't have anything to worry about. And they almost took it that far. Well, maybe I'm doing hyperbole. We'll see in a moment. Anyways, Grayson continued, I make no doubt the same arguments were used on a variety of occasions. I suppose, sir, that this argument was used when Cromwell was invested with power. And if you look up Cromwell, you'll know that the founders were not a big fan of that guy. And this wasn't just ancient history to the founding generation. They had lived it firsthand in the Revolution. They saw it happen, or they learned about it from around the world as well. He said the same argument was used to gain our assent to the Stamp Act, going back to the principles of the Revolution, 1765. He said, I have no doubt it has been invariably the argument in all countries when the concession of power has been in agitation. This should sound familiar to all of us through our entire lives. If you're concerned about someone having power or too much power, it's always, well, we're only going to use it for this. It's only going to be against the worst of the worst people. And then you never think about the long run. The Anti-Federalists certainly were giving us a very long run approach with their thinking. Anyways, Grayson continued, and he delivered really the hard-hitting punchline on this one. The only sane way, the only reasonable way to delegate power is to assume that everyone who wields it will be bad. And if you think about it that way, then you're going to be much more cautious about what power they give you, or you give them, and then over time, you'll probably have less attacks on your liberty. It's not going to stop it, of course. He said, but power ought to have such checks and limitations as to prevent bad men from abusing it. It's not just about relying on them to do the right thing or to have good people there, and then somehow those good people aren't tempted by the power. It's about real concrete limits on it. He said it ought to be granted on a supposition that men will be bad, for it may be eventually so. The impartial examiner summed up the entire Federalist case. It comes down to one non-negotiable rule. You never give any power if you can't either stop its abuse or you can't punish the abusers. He said, hence, should it not be a maxim, never to be forgotten, that a free people ought to entrust no set of men with powers that may be abused without control, or afford opportunities to designing men to carry dangerous measures into execution without being responsible for their conduct? Now, on some of the anti-federalist arguments, the Federalist side just brushed them off. They were totally condescending about them. Not these arguments about trust and power. They didn't brush this off. They didn't ignore it. They actually built a three-pronged rebuttal. One, we must trust them. We must. Two, here is why you can trust this particular system. And then three, if we don't have trust in these people in this system, well, you're going to have total chaos. Of course, a little fear-mongering in there as well. So let's kick this off with future Chief Justice John Marshall, who often plays the villain in these stories, but he basically made the case that you had one option or the other. Either you trust agents in government or you have no government at all. And I don't think he was trying to threaten us with a good time here, but here's how he put it. You cannot exercise the powers of government personally yourselves. You must trust agents. If so, he said, will you dispute giving them the power of acting for you from an existing possibility that they may abuse it? As long, he said, as it is impossible for you to transact your business in person, if you repose no confidence in delegates because there is a possibility of their abusing it, you can have no government, for the power of doing good is inseparable from that of doing evil. So certainly he's recognizing the trust issue, but he's saying, like, look, this is our only choice here. It's all or nothing, and you can't actually not trust people. I don't know why he didn't just say, well, let's not trust anybody and suspect everyone who approaches that jewel, but instead it's all or nothing here. That he was not alone on this, and there are two other Chief Justices who took a very similar position. We'll get to that in just a moment, but first of all, while I realize I am blasting through a lot of really important historical information in this debate over trust, it's my hope that this episode, like every single episode, serves as a bit of a highlight reel for you. And if you're the type of person who hears this and wants to learn more, because I'm just scratching the surface, you are in luck, because the TAC has your back. After every single episode, we publish a blog post for that episode that includes all the stuff that I'm mentioning in the show. Alan Mosley organizes the blog. Thank you, Alan, for being awesome on this work, consistent and very, very accurate in this. As long as I do a good job with my notes, he does even better. But in the blog post that I'll get published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, it's all spelled out, Alan will have a show links section about halfway down the page that includes all the reference links that I'm mentioning, generally in the order that I go through it in the show. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Now let's get back to the bevy of Chief Justices or future Chief Justices. John Marshall kicked it off talking about trust. You got to trust these people. Then we have Oliver Ellsworth, who was the future third Chief Justice. Here he is writing as a landholder, a series of essays in support of ratification. He hammered that same argument home that John Marshall did. Well, Marshall was much later than Ellsworth on this particular argument. Ellsworth, like he was kind of known to do, he ramped up the hyperbole, basically calling, well, the opponents kind of crazy. He said the right of the legislature to ordain laws binding on the people gives them a power to make bad laws. Again, he's recognizing that you do have a situation where you're giving people power and they may abuse that power, also acknowledging the human nature. He said the right of the judge to inflict punishments gives him both power and opportunity to oppress the innocent. Yet, none but crazy men will from thence determine that it is best to have neither a legislature nor judges. I'm friends with a few crazy men these days. Now let's look at another Chief Justice, the first Chief Justice, John Jay, in an address to to the people of the state of New York, this is in April of 1788, he made the case that refusing to trust people with power is as dumb as a sick man refusing medicine. Interesting analogy here, because of course the Federalist side was seeing the system that they were living under as a sickness, a terrible disease that couldn't get enough energy in the general government. And so therefore, the medicine was the Constitution for these United States. Anyways, Jay put it like this: experience will better determine such questions than theoretical arguments. And so far as the danger of abuses is urged against the institution of a government, remember that a power to do good always involves a power to do harm. Jay understood human nature here. But he was saying, like, look, we can't have that shut us down completely here. We got to do more stuff. Let's take that risk. He said, we must, in the business of government, as well as in all other business, have some degree of confidence, as well as a great degree of caution. I think he was much more moderate than people like Ellsworth and, of course, John Marshall. He said, who on a sick bed would refuse medicines from a physician merely because it is as much in his power to administer deadly poisons as salutary remedies? I know there's arguments against this argument. Of course, the market rewards physicians who don't kill their patients. But on the other hand, government, when they screw up, they tend to get rewarded with more power and money and control. So it's kind of an opposite reward structure. But that's a different episode as well. Now, keep in mind, all three of those future chief justices were framing the argument as all or nothing. Trust this plan or get none at all. Not like you could just trust the plan or keep the Articles of Confederation. That wasn't the argument. It was all or nothing. And so George Nicholas in Virginia, he really explains our prong two here for people who didn't buy into that, and not everybody bought into that argument, of course. He made the case for why, even if you generally don't trust people with power, you can still trust this system, this plan. He said, I will trust Congress because they will be actuated by motives of fellow feeling. They can make no regulations but what will affect themselves, their friends, and relations. And I really at least try my best when I'm presenting these arguments of both sides here to really not tell you my feelings about it till at least the end. But man, this here from George Nicholas, who did a lot of really awesome stuff, but this sounds to me really incredibly naive, as if people with power are somehow not insulated from the bad stuff they do. Certainly the people with power have always been insulated. They don't get the impact, and that's why they keep wielding this power, because it benefits them to the detriment of the rest of society. So for George Nicholas, who actually had a lot of really great takes throughout his career, this, I think, is pretty dumb, that they're just not going to make any bad laws because their friends and family are going to get harmed by it. Well, maybe early on, but I don't think that lasted very long at all. And in North Carolina, a guy who I don't think I've ever cited before, I actually have never really read about him before, Whitmill Hill. This is July 26th, 1788. He closed it out with some fear mongering that I thought hit really well here. Trust the system, or you're going to get basically dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. He said, but gentlemen are jealous and unwilling to trust government, though they are their own representatives. Again, it's the same argument that the representatives are just us. And what do we do? Not trust ourselves? He said their maxim, talking about the antis, trust them with no power. This holds against all government. Another threat, anarchy will ensue, he said, if government be not trusted. And Patrick Henry, of course, was not buying this trust the plan line. He wasn't falling for the fear mongering and the concern over how terrible things were going to be. He wasn't worried about dogs and cats, none of it. He sarcastically threw their arguments right back in their face. He said, we are told we are afraid to trust ourselves, that our own representatives, Congress, will not exercise their powers oppressively, that we will not enslave ourselves, that the militia cannot enslave themselves, etc. And then he hit them with a history lesson, something they all should know. Who really brings tyranny? Well, it's often the people themselves. He said, who has enslaved France, Spain, Germany, Turkey, and other countries which groan under tyranny? He said, they have been enslaved by the hands of their own people. If it will be so in America, it will be only as it has been everywhere else. Being a student of history, a student of human nature, Patrick Henry knew if you set up a similar scenario here, as you've seen in other places, well, things are going to play out pretty similarly. It's the old saying of history doesn't always repeat, but it certainly does rhyme. Now, here's the interesting twist about all this. We're going to go back to the American Revolution, the height of it. 1772, John Adams laid out the maxim, trust none of them. John Adams is one of the high nationalists, one of the biggest big government guys of the founding. And in 1772, he's like, trust no one. End of story. He said there is danger from all men. The only maxim of a free government ought to be to trust no man living with the power to endanger the public liberty. Trust none of them ever. If they have the power to endanger, not even destroy, but just put it under threat, you should not trust any of them with that. Well, maybe he's not saying necessarily don't let them have the power, but certainly do not trust them with it. Then he cited a bunch of British history. He went through it pretty quickly here because everyone understood that history, unlike today where people have no idea what anyone is talking about with important historical references. Everyone understood this stuff. He was talking about the Earl of Stratford, Harley, Sir Robert Walpole. He said, in England, the common route to power has been by making clamorous professions of patriotism in early life. So it was the people, he recognized a pattern, at least in England, and that's really recent history for them, something they all understood from their own tradition, that it was the people who were really loud and proud about being patriots, supporters of liberty. They used that early on, and then they got great popularity from it. Again, this sounds really familiar. He said, and to ride upon that popularity into the highest offices of state. And after they have arrived there, they have been generally found as little zealous to preserve the Constitution as their predecessors whom they have hunted down. Basically, get really popular, supporting liberty, talking about it, telling everybody how all the awesome stuff you're going to do, but as soon as you get in office, you start twisting it the other direction, and you end up using your power to destroy liberty. Now, in a letter to John Adams just a few years later, his wife, Abigail Adams, she made the same case. It was the same maxim. Trust none of them. They are all dangerous, period. And then on top of it, she followed up with, well, a warning about human nature that turns out to be absolutely prophetic. She said, I am more and more convinced that man is a dangerous creature, and that power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping. And like the grave, cries, give, give. She said, the great fish swallow up the small. And he who is most strenuous for the rights of the people, when vested with power, is as eager after the prerogatives of government. Again, the short story on this is that the people who actually sound like they're most in support of liberty, once they get in power, they are terrible about their support for liberty. And this was prophetic because the most powerful, tragic proof of this maxim came from the man that she sent that to, John Adams himself. So think about this. What happened when the man who gave the warning started to get the power? Well, first of all, in his political writings, he praised the British system that they fought a long, bloody war to secede from. Probably not a popular take, but this was a very popular book. But he called the British system the most stupendous fabric of human invention. Then, as vice president under George Washington, he made the case in the Senate that President Washington, or any president for that matter, should have a regal title. Here's one he suggested: His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of their Liberties, like Lord of the Realm kind of thing. And then once he got in office as president himself, of course, he signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which criminalized free speech, a direct attack on the First Amendment, just years out of the gate. And he used this, they actively used this to jail political opponents. And then on top of it, it was so obviously corrupt because it was illegal to bring members of the federal government into ill repute. But there was a carve out, a direct caveat. You could, no issue with bringing the vice president into ill repute, because that was John Adams's political opponent and the Federalist opponent, Thomas Jefferson. So it should be no surprise if you put this all together that opponents of John Adams really saw him as transitioning to a monarchist. From Atlas of Independence, the man who was striving for the rights of the people, free and independent states, turned into a monarchist. And that's how Mercy Otis Warren described it in her great History of the American Revolution. She said, endowed with a comprehensive genius, well acquainted with the history of men and nations, and having long appeared to be actuated by the principles of integrity, by a zeal for the rights of men, and an honest indignation at the ideas of despotism, it was viewed as a kind of political phenomenon when discovered that Mr. Adams's former opinions were beclouded by a partiality for monarchy. And I think if you tie all this together, you look at this story, at least my take, I think is going to be pretty obvious. Trust no one with power. And no one means no one, because that also includes trust none of the people who tell you trust no one with power. And you're never, unfortunately, going to hear this kind of a message, these lessons in the government-run and government-approved so-called education system. And that's why we work so hard every single day here at the TAC to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles from the founders and the old revolutionaries, and of course, the great thinkers that they read and learned from. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly devaluing dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, it's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I'm very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us here at the TAC today. Of course, if you don't want to become a member, that's cool, and you still want to help us out, that's super awesome. You can make a one-time gift, a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate, whether you're using fiat or other forms of payment. You can also mail in some real sound money as well, like goldbacks. We accept whatever works best for you. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Of course, there's a bunch of free and easy peasy things you can do to help us spread the word, whether you're not ready to make a contribution or not able to at this time. It's all awesome. We're going to continue doing this work. We've got thousands of articles and blog posts. I have no idea how many episodes I've been doing, but I've been doing this for a few years now, and I really appreciate you being here. So if you hit the like button, subscribe, get notifications, leave reviews on Apple Podcasts, comments in the archive or on any platform, and watch time percentage on the video platform. So like if you watch a 20-minute video for 20 minutes, that's 100%. 60 minutes, 300%. I'm going to keep getting better. 1,000%. I can't do the math because I went to government-run school, but you get the idea. The more you watch, the more likely the platform will show us to more people. I'm very grateful for your help. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was interesting, maybe a little entertaining here and there, but more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. Again, I really appreciate you being here. Hope you enjoyed the show, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the path to liberty.